Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jigyasa, and today I am going to talk about humanitarian intervention and sovereignty. The GPC that I would like to talk about is security, which will be analyzed with reference to NATO interference in Libyan Civil War 2011 on international, national, and local levels. Humanitarian intervention is based on the belief that when a government turns savagely upon its own people, it becomes the responsibility of any state capable of stopping the slaughter to try to do so. The philosophy behind the humanitarian intervention is simple. It stems from the principle that intervention for human protection purposes is supportable when major harm to civilians is occurring or imminently apprehended, and the state in question is unable or unwilling to end the harm or is itself the perpetrator. Now, the question is, how is humanitarian intervention affecting the sovereignty of a country? Sovereignty is not nearly as absolute as it's sometimes presented to be. The interveners need not to be other states. Numerous examples exist of non-forceful intervention that usually are not so labeled but which come to the same result. To assert that states have a choice of accepting a loan and therefore the acceptance of restructuring or other conditions is a sovereign act that stretches credibility. The humanitarian interventions do not necessarily require employment of military force, as they could include, for example, the imposition of sanctions. The term refers normally to situations in which force is used. For example, international lenders like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and regional development banks all intervene by setting conditions to loans and requiring restructuring. My case study is Libyan Civil War 2011. 19th March 2011, the military intervention in Libya on the basis of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 began. The Libyan Civil War, also known as Libyan Revolution, was an armed conflict in the northern African state of Libya fought between forces loyal to Colonel Muammar Gaddafi and those trying to end his government. On 21st February 2011, the Libyan opposition called on the United Nations to impose no-fly zone on all Tripoli to cut off all supplies of arms to the regime. Military operations began, with US forces and one British submarine firing cruise missiles, the French Air Force, United States Air Force, and British Royal Air Force undertaking ground actions across Libya, and a naval blockade was established by Royal Navy. On 24th March, NATO agreed to take control of the no-fly zone while command of targeting ground units remains with coalition forces. Fighting in Libya ended in late October following the death of Muammar Gaddafi, and NATO stated it would end operations over Libya on 31st October 2011. As you can see, the northern parts of Libya, this is where the war actually had taken place. And now you can go through this picture and see the present condition of the Libya. Variation of just at Bellum and just in bello principle. Just at Bellum refers to the conditions where under which states may resort to war or to the use of armed force in general. The prohibition against the use of force amongst states and the exceptions to do it set out in United Nations Charter of 1945 are the core ingredients of Jus ad Bellum. Just and bello regulates the conduct of parties engaged in an armed conflict. It seeks to minimize suffering in armed conflicts, notably by protecting and assisting all victims of armed conflict to the greatest extent possible. Gaddafi's Libya was known to possess vast resources, particularly in form of oil reserves and financial capital. Some of the scholars state that the international military intervention in Libya is not about bombing for democracy or Muammar Gaddafi's head. Legally, morally, politically, and militarily, it has only one justification: protecting the country's people. Based on 1973 United Nations Security Council resolution, NATO was accused of being responsible for deaths of far more civilians than if it had not intervened, according to those opposed to the intervention. This deviation was not respected to the Article 2 and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, on which it stresses that no use of force against political independence of any state except in some circumstances. As a research observation, the Libyan intervention by NATO had some critics. The Western intervention was motivated by political hidden, resources hidden, economic hidden, before then democratic reasons and humanitarian reasons. However, Those in favor of that intervention saw that the military intervention in Libya is an example of responsibility to protect adopted by United Nations at 2005 World Summit, sovereignty and security. States have always treated sovereignty according to Robert Goyhan as a bargainable resource, compromising it under duress or surrendering portions of it in return for substantial benefits. In the new millennium, the reasons for intervention have increased to include regime change and imposition of democratic form of government and free market norms. Discourses of security operates on the basis of certain understandings of sovereignty. Questions such as who is to be secured and from what threats necessarily entail an engagement with sovereignty. Sovereignty for realists involves the territorial inviolability of the state from external interference in a manner consistent with the depiction of sovereignty in the Treaty of Westphalia and the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence by the state. The relationship between security, sovereignty, and identity is such that security discourses can be located in and are indeed partially constructed by actors' conceptions of sovereignty and through their attempts to either engage with the order. In other words, realist conceptions of security involve a simultaneous move for states of promising security, asserting sovereignty, and reifying the dichotomy between inside and outside, self and other. By contrast, critical security discourses contest the idea of states as necessary agents of security and define the provision of security in such a way as to problematize and critique sovereignty and the dichotomy between self and the other. Levels of analysis. The Libya is one of the case study of American politics where American authority wanted to take the relay of Western military expenditures in its particular object to protect Africa continent from the alternatives offered by China. NATO intervention in Libya were to change the regime in Libya by protecting the French interest in Africa with breaking Libya becoming the alternative financial of the continent. NATO launched Operation Unified Protector with the advertised aims of enforcing an arms embargo, maintaining a no fly zone, and protecting civilians and civilian populated areas from attack or the threat of attack. This is the initial evidence that NATO had what appeared to be mandated focused on responsibility to protect, yet the outcome of the intervention contradicts with this analysis. NATO involvement in Libya has been supported by scholars such as Pattinson, who state that the actions of the Gaddafi government met the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty test, thereby justifying a NATO intervention. In the national level, NATO may have had the initial goal of protecting civilians. There is a substantial amount of evidence that suggests that the intervention was focused on regime change. For example, the bombing of Gaddafi's forces in his hometown Sirte. This was seen largely unjustified as the Gaddafi military posed a negligible threat to the local population as the local residents were supporting the Gaddafi regime and therefore was tactical decision focused on dismantling the manpower of the Libyan army rather than welfare of Libyan people. Another key indicator which suggests that NATO was more concerned with the expulsion of Gaddafi from power was the arming and training of the rebel groups who were fighting Gaddafi regime. It was reported that NATO helped through coordinated bomb strikes, but acknowledged that the means for doing so were convoluted and indirect. Britain also declared that NATO was providing intelligence and reconnaissance information to the rebels. Whereas on the local level, a Nations report stated that sub-Saharan Africans, in some cases accused of suspected or being mercenaries, constitute a large number of detainees. Some detainees have reportedly been subjected to torture. Rebel forces had emptied entire villages of black Libyans and black African women were raped by rebel forces in the refugee camps outside Tripoli. These reports illustrate that while NATO may have been actively engaging in the Gaddafi regime militarily, the organization failed in the protection of the Libyan people and therefore failed to adequately intervene under responsibility to protect. NATO's focus on regime change in the Libya conflict had been urged to be a form of United States-backed imperialism. To conclude, Libya is one of the case study of American politics where the American authority wanted to take the relay of Western military expenditures in its particular object to protect Africa continent from the alternatives offered by China. The NATO intervention in Libya was extremely controversial due to its failure in outlining what the true objectives were. Although the intervention were framed under responsibility to protect, it is clearly that a regime change was the priority for NATO, though it does not follow from that NATO failed to protect the Libyan population in its eternity. As discussed, it is unquestionable that NATO's certain priority was regime change, and this was achieved. However, this alteration of mission objectives questions the legitimacy of the intervention and of NATO itself. In context of Libyan case, the researchers believe that stakeholders did not respect the principle of non-discriminatory action because they only have the CNT to overthrow Gaddafi regime and not the civilian population, whereas a military aid given to one party to the conflict cannot be considered to be strictly humanitarian. So these are the sources from where I collected the entire information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to text me. Thank you.